Hello everyone, thank you for joining me today. My name is Elsa Torres. Today's webinar specifically looks at person-centered planning within education when it comes to matters of part-time timetables. So the content for today's session, we're going to be covering, as I said earlier on, reduced timetables. So we're going to be starting off by looking at statutory duties, and we're going to cover England and Wales because actually the agenda and the law is very, very similar, almost the same. And we're going to talk and explore when is a good time to use a part-time timetable. We're going to look at the interpretation of the guidance, both in England and Wales, and very often how schools' needs are placed first above the child's needs when it comes to planning a part-time timetable. And we're going to look at the lens through the parent's lens as well as the professional's lens. So we're going to bring the two together in terms of understanding the position from each party. And we'll also touch on vulnerable learners and children at the end. So what we do know is that in Wales and in England, the guidance clearly states that all children are of compulsory school age are entitled to a full-time education. It's very, very exceptional when a part-time timetable is implemented or put in place to meet an individual needs. It is an exceptional circumstance. And the guidance really emphasises that any kind of reduced timetable should always be part of a formalised plan. It's not something that you just do on a wing or a whim, but it's regularly reviewed and it should be treated as a short-term solution. It's never a long-term solution. The law also clearly states that regardless of circumstances, all children are entitled to a full-time education, which is suitable to their age, to their ability, to their aptitude, and obviously their additional needs as well. And it's a school's statutory duty to provide full-time education for all their children and young people. So with regards to the local authority, they have a statutory duty to ensure that full-time provision is made available, and that provision needs to be appropriate to the needs of the child and for the child and the young person deemed as not fit for school because of medical conditions and medical reasons, then clear alternatives and solutions need to be part of that plan in working with the family. I outline just below there on that slide as well the full-time expectation of children accessing education from reception through to year 11, which is the same for England and Wales. Now, the definition of a part-time timetable specifically says it's an arrangement where a child is not required to attend school for the full school day, but instead attends for reduced hours as part of a planned intervention to meet their individual needs. And I think that's really important to sort of explore that because it's part of a planned intervention. It's not just something that is put into place without consulting and without real well-considered thinking. So let's look into this a bit further. So it can be used when, for example, as a part of a formal agreement, it needs to be really well documented. So, for example, it would be part of a school support package where a child, due to absence, lots of absence, has been really disaffected. So it could be part of the strategic position of the school to working closely with the family and with the child to get that child in. It could also be part of a reintegration package. So the child who's been off for quite some time because of medical and emotional needs. So a reduced timetable to get them back into school is an obvious option. But of course, it could also be used for complex behaviour needs or as part of a support plan. And we'll come back to that in a little while because that's a really important point. You know, when do we use a part-time timetable for managing the management of behaviour? So it could also be part of a medical plan with where health professionals together with education and the family, put a plan in place, and the focus is very much on the child's recovery from a serious medical condition, and that's the priority outcome. It's safeguarding the child's needs there. In most instances, it states across the guidance that it shouldn't be longer than 6 weeks for the child to be fully integrated. And I think that's going to be something that we will also explore, whether 6 weeks is the right kind of number. So when do young people require reduced timetables? Now, all of us, any one of us at any one point, it's a human natural need that as adults we might need to take time off work because of circumstances that happen in our lives and that are very distressing, or circumstances that force you to take a break for whatever reason because of other more extenuating circumstances. So the same thing applies to a child. So children might need a reduced timetable because of family circumstances, because they are going through some kind of experience which is just too much for them to cope with. And that could be a plethora of reasons. It could also, of course, be because of mental health and their social and emotional well-being and those difficulties and how they're presenting themselves. The environment is just too overwhelming. But of course, it could also be because of physical and medical conditions. I would also say that it could be because of their neurodivergent needs and that the environment is not suitably set up to enable them to access. So again, there might be a need for a child to access a reduced timetable to sort of mitigate all those problems and work towards being part of a full-time timetable. It's never just for one reason. When we come to planning for a reduced timetable, as I said before, it's always because of exceptional reasons. So these exceptional reasons means that there are things that the school and the family have been working really hard on together in terms of trying to solution focus on moving a situation forward. But there's always a combination of other things that's, I think, leads families to that point where the school and the family agree that a part-time timetable is appropriate. And it could be as well sort of the other reasons underlying the reason for having to take time out of school could be because of intersectional reasons, so socioeconomic issues and so matters around poverty and just access. It could be because of sexual orientation. I've worked with a number of young people who have really struggled with their gender identity and how the environment that they felt was unsafe for them. It could be because of their religious beliefs and that they want to wear particular clothes, which the school doesn't allow. There's lots of different reasons in addition to the ones that were previously mentioned. What I wanted to get across is that it's never just one thing. And when we plan for a reduced timetable, we're planning for the whole child and what are all the factors affecting that child. So when it comes to the principles outlined both in England and Wales regarding part-time timetables, it does say that a reduced timetable should only be used temporarily to meet a young person's individual needs. And so, for example, for medical reasons, as part of a reintegration plan, which we've already mentioned, it should never be considered as part of a long-term solution. That is just not acceptable. A formal plan should always outline the support that is required, and it needs to be very clear in terms of its time-bound goals as well. Schools should aim to return the pupil to full-time education or an appropriate alternative provision as quickly as possible. The thing to also remember, and this is really, really key for parents and for professionals, is that no part-time timetable can ever be imposed on a family. So this is something that is done in collaboration together with the child and the family as the next step to make an improvement in their access. And the starting point when pursuing this kind of route of a part-time table always has to be a risk assessment, because it is about understanding where that child is in terms of all the risks if they go on a part-time table, whether it's the academic risks, whether it's social and emotional risks, physical risks. And we'll expand on that in a little while. As I've said before, part-time timetables are always a last resort, because you get to that point where actually the school and the parents have put lots of adaptations, lots of sort of plans in place, collaborated, they've been working hard together with the child, and things are just not making the progress that they need to. In fact, it might be that it's causing more stress and more challenges for that young person being in school, for example. So it's got to be something that there's an ongoing problem solving with the learner and the family, and that you've been problem solving consistently with the family. And in addition, you've also brought in external services to support. And I think as parents, depending on what those circumstances are, I would always advise as much as possible that you also ensure that you are involving other professionals. So someone like your GP, as an example, in terms of the discussions around the challenges that they might be having. And I can't imagine not involving the GP for example, if it's particular complex behaviours, because what you'd want to be doing is obviously pursuing neurodevelopmental pathways, etc., etc. Professionals have a duty to consider the implications that going down the route of a part-time timetable will have and might have on a family, because it is a massive responsibility, and I think we cannot underestimate that. Because when going down a part-time timetable, it might mean that a member of the family, a parent, might have to give up work to look after the child when they're not in school. And so there potentially will be financial implications to the family as well. And in some cases, I'm aware of how it's pushed them into poverty. There are also implications around mental health. Things will only get worse at home, because unless it's been really well considered and really well planned with the family, with the child, and the outcomes are really clear and the steps are totally relative to where the child is, it can make things much worse. And again, we'll explore that. And let's not forget that a part-time timetable does mean that it will, in addition, put in naturally a lot of strain on the family. And in many instances, families do find this quite overwhelming, and it even causes family breakdown. What the evidence says is that in many instances, part-time timetables exacerbate the problem to the young person. It doesn't really sort out the problem in itself. It's if it's not well considered and well managed, it makes things much worse. So when it comes to starting the whole planning and the thought process around planning for a child with a part-time timetable, I think it's really important that we put the learner at the centre. It's got to be child-centred. And so we are focusing on the child, and we start off with a risk assessment. And it's really about understanding the economic factors that will those implications to the family, but also to the child, particularly if they are on free school meals and there are difficulties within the home, which means there are other things that need to be considered. There's an implication as well that the child will become more socially isolated, so disconnecting with their friends, not seeing their friends very often. Friendship groups move on very quickly in school, and those have got implication. That's got implication around he or she's social and emotional well-being. And I would always say that when planning for a child's risk assessment, I always focus on English and maths. Obviously, we plan around their subjects of interest, but English and maths are two subjects that just cannot be compromised in a part-time timetable, for the simple reason that they are access subjects, and they are access subjects to everything else. So when that young person returns to school, returns to education, they need to be able to hold on to engagement and to access. And if they've had consistent, high quality English and maths and have kept up to date with their peers in those two subjects, it makes re-engagement more possible. And of course, I think it's really important that we consider what the child's aspirations are. So when we're planning these things, it's always thinking about, where are we going with this in the future? What do you want to do? What are you aiming to do in the future? And because we need to also plan about how do we mitigate any sort of difficulties in that child being able to achieve what they want to achieve. So we have to look and be realistic and have the conversations about the implications to their academic progress as well. So being transparent is really important, so that everybody's on the same page. So the statutory duties for local authorities is that if a school decides to go down the route of a part-time timetable with a family, it is a statutory duty to report it to the local authority. In fact, in some instances, schools, certainly in Wales, I don't think this is the case in England, but in Wales, they have to seek permission from their local authority, who tracks the whole process. And they have a duty, really, to ensure that all children of compulsory school age receive the education that they are entitled to. And the Welsh Government around inclusion and pupil support mandates proactive intervention to track and support pupils at risk of disengagement or absence. So this is a potential tool to support that process of attendance. And there's safeguarding implications. So when planning for your risk assessment, it is considering the full spectrum, the holistic understanding of how this is going to impact both negatively and obviously looking at the positives, but looking at the negatives as well around safeguarding on that young person. So naturally in schools, they have safeguarding responsibilities and duties to the young person that need to be planned for. And the legal framework is really clear in England and Wales that it does require local authorities, governing bodies, and the head teachers to ensure that their function are exercised with a view to safeguard and promote the welfare of children. And I've already mentioned already about schools having to notify their local authority. That is really important. So as when we get to the point of planning for a part-time timetable, the starting point is, as we've already discussed, the risk assessment. And remember, this is a very serious turning point, which really requires well-considered, well-informed planning. It has to be personalised and bespoke to the child that you're working with. And there's so much research and there's so much evidence that show that in many instances, part-time timetables do not lead the learner back into education, and there are lots of sort of that's why there's so much resistance around going down the part-time timetables. And if you're a parent, you should be asking lots of questions, and you really do need a formalised plan, because being on a part-time timetable, if it's not managed well, we've talked about, feeling isolated, disconnected from the community. It can be an extremely traumatic event and have traumatic consequences to the child, being isolated from their peers. So it can result in all sorts of other sort of challenges that will make returning to school very difficult and have lifelong concerns as well. So we talked earlier about behaviour, and I think I want to sort of make that really important point that schools should not or must not use a part-time timetable to manage a learner's behaviour. That is not what part-time timetable is all about. Schools need to be much more intelligent in terms of how they're engaging with young people as soon as possible when there are behaviour concerns. And a learner should not be used or put or placed on a reduced timetable because of their special educational needs. This does, it may, in most instances, constitutes discrimination. So when we looking at working with children, the first instance, the school must always engage with meeting the needs. So it's looking at the graduated approach when things start bubbling, and that communication between home and school is really vital to secure the ease and flow of those conversations, because ideally, all schools, good schools, they are. They've got the positive relationships with their community, their families, and so they are in tune with the challenges that their community is experiencing. So when a child, as we can see over here, when a child starts presenting behaviours, whatever behaviours we see up here on the top of the iceberg, let's not forget that actually there are lots of other things that are happening. So if we go back to the whole concept of behaviour, remember that behaviour is a symptom of something else. It's a form of communication. They're misbehaving because they are really struggling with communication. They're struggling with access. They could be very hungry. They could be very lonely. They could be really just not being able to engage in their community very positively. So they outwardly are demonstrating other very negative behaviours to sort of, that's their way of communicating. They don't know that children don't always know how to communicate to parents and to professionals, that they feel shame or that they're embarrassed or that they don't understand. And let's not forget that a lot of children on the surface, everything looks just absolutely fine, absolutely perfect. But children mask as well, and particularly neurodivergent children are ace at masking. And so it's really important that we recognise that working with the family is critical in order to be able to understand a child, because the family will know best in terms of where their child is coming from. And children just becoming isolated and withdrawn, that in itself is a form of just behaviour, that they just don't know how to engage in their community. So if we go back to an explosive child, a child who is really just absolutely, their behaviour is appalling and extremely difficult, the most important thing that a school can do is to prioritise building those relationships with the family and really understanding those underlying triggers. You know, behaviour, as I've already just mentioned, it's about other things that are happening. And it's really important as professionals that we move away from opinions and judgments, and that the focus needs to be on collaborating with the family and having compassion, really listening to the voice of the parent, listening to the voice of the child. And I think it's really important that we remind ourselves that both in England and in Wales, the code of practice is really clear, and it states that actually when it comes to working with children, it needs to be needs-led. You don't need a diagnosis for them to access the support. So when you're seeing challenging behaviour, you can't say, and I've heard this, and that's why I'm going to say it, oh, they don't have a diagnosis, so they need to be just treated like everybody else and just put in detention. No, you have to, when a child is under stress, when a child is experiencing challenges within education, however those behaviours are presenting themselves, we need to connect with those behaviours. And what we see is that children, when they are in a really rough, tough state, it does impact on their body. Their whole physiology represents those difficulties. And that's because they can become very overwhelmed. They just don't know how to communicate. They don't know how to ask for help. Their behavior can become destructive because they don't know how to ask for help. And so when talking to them, it's really hard for them to process and to actually think rationally. So talking to an angry child or shouting at an angry child, that they're not going to be able to respond positively. If anything, it's just going to escalate and escalate and escalate. And that's really important. So it's very much about the adult and how the adult needs to engage with that and co-regulate with that young person. And let's not forget, children are not dissimilar to us. If I'm sure any one of us, if we really lost our rag and just exploded in front of people that we don't know or that we know well, there's an element of shame and embarrassment about our behaviour. So I would imagine that the children, that any child experiencing this, it will impact on how they see themselves. So it will be there'll be a lot of shame. They'll feel like they've out of control, and so they have lots of sort of low self-esteem, and it impacts on their relationships with their friends, their peers, their peer group, and teachers as well, because we then start having that judgment lens in terms of the challenges that they're presenting. But are we curious enough? And I suppose that's the question. How curious are we to sort of explore further on what's happening with that child? And of course, it could be that those behaviours are because of lots of other reasons, such as ADHD, autism, anxiety, trauma, sensory processing difficulties. But teachers are not qualified to make a diagnosis. That's not our bag. Our bag is to look at these behaviours, to consider these behaviours, to report these behaviours. Our bag is to talk to families about it and to sort of explore these behaviours further and to find and adapt strategies to be preventative. Because remember, at some point, if problems persist, your role is to then be able to write about what those behaviours look like and when they happen. So it could also be anxiety. So children experience all sorts of things, just like any adult. But I think when you're dealing with an anxious child, the most important thing to remember is that school sees versus what a parent experiences are two completely different things. And I've heard schools saying they're absolutely fine in school. Yeah, I know. But then they have these meltdowns at home because they're just overwhelmed and can't cope once they've got home because they've just held it together all day. It's really important that schools really invest time in understanding that child's behaviour through the lens of the parent. That's really, really important. And I think children, particularly neurodivergent children, they're renowned, or neurodivergent people, doesn't matter what age you are really, they are renowned for masking, and particularly girls, they certainly want to, within the school day, present themselves with perfect behaviour, and that becomes their mask. They can even be high achievers, and but actually those true feelings, that anxiety, the sweaty palms, the dizziness, the headaches, the fatigue, the stomach aches, all those things are not visible to the school. You don't see them, or they're not communicated with you. And these are things that families can talk to you about. The parents can sort of help the school to understand. So it's really important that relationship between home and school is one that is valued and respected. So when planning a part-time timetable, as I've already alluded to, it's in many instances I've seen schools, and I've just seen this recently actually, the school saying you can only have a part-time timetable for 6 weeks. That's the school's agenda, that's the local authority's agenda, because that's what's written in the guidance. But actually it's got to be led by the child. It could be 2 weeks, it could be 6 weeks, but it could also be 10 weeks, it could be longer. So it's got to be led by the needs of the child and the planning around the child in terms of, once they're on a reduced timetable, how does the school and the family continue to work together to move towards those increments in their timetable so that they can be reintegrated back into school. And that's going to have to take quite considerable thinking and planning. So going back to looking at just the challenges that we see within school with certain children, some do say that, oh, it's just a diagnosis, it's just a label. Well, actually, it's much more than a label. It's about a lens, because without that lens, you may look at me and make judgments based on what you see, but with the lens of my diagnosis, you can look at me with greater understanding of what you are really seeing. And I think that's really, really important, because we all know how difficult it is for a child to get a diagnosis. There's something like a 3-year waiting list. But that 3-year waiting list, naturally, in good schools, the schools will be working very closely with the family and problem solving to manage those difficulties. But where a child has already got a diagnosis, it's really important to understand that diagnosis, because how they access that environment is going to be very dependent on how the school really sees that child and understands that child's condition. Now, I would say that when placing a child on a part-time timetable, this is a very high-level sort of intervention, so it's quite exceptional. We've talked about that. It's exceptional when a child goes into a part-time timetable. Schools apply, whether you're in England or in Wales, schools apply a graduated response to meeting children's needs. Okay, and the universal provision, by the way, is just what 100% of the children in the school access naturally. So, and that's the same across England and Wales. So that's high quality teaching and learning. But as children need more and more, that's different to other children, then the school starts planning specifically to their child's needs, what in addition they need to put in place in order to enable that child to access. So I would say that a reduced timetable is going to be somewhere around the top of the hill. And I would certainly say that most of those children would have an IDP or an educational healthcare plan, or are moving towards one, because their level of difficulties are quite substantial. And I think one cannot underestimate that. It might not always be the case, but in most instances, their level of challenges, their level of access is such that they are moving towards an educational healthcare plan or an IDP. The most important thing is that working with children who are going through really difficult times, it's all about professionals adopting that kind of collaborative lens and that collaborative approach. Reduced timetables can be used more effectively to support recovery when schools and or education and services are working collaboratively with parents. It's a tough time for parents. And by that collaboration is vital, and it will save families from a lot of despair and suffering, because it becomes really, really challenging, as you can imagine. And in many instances, parents feel very judged, and they feel quite isolated. They really, really struggle, and we cannot underestimate that, how difficult it is for a parent. So adopting a lens where you are seeking to understand the family, the parents' circumstances as well, in order to be part of your problem solving moving forward for that child, is really important. I know that in Wales and in England as well, not necessarily in all cases in England, and there will be other plans, but because we've said, if a reduced timetable is a very exceptional arrangement. So at the very least, you need to have a pastoral support plan in place from the very start. And this is something that it's a framework which holds all that information about the details of the learner, in terms of what their strengths are and what those challenges are. And it's a document that is shared and it's planned with parents and professionals. It's not just given to parents. It's not just given to schools from local authority. It doesn't work that way. It's a planned collaborative document. And within that, it identifies all the agreed sort of planning for the family and for the school, and the kind of actions that each one is going to be responsible for. It must outline everyone's responsibilities and expectations. And it's also where you document and evidence all the meetings that take place, all the progress that's taken place, all the actions that have been taking place so far, the challenges that continue, or the things that have moved on, and identifying what's working well and what we need help with. So this document is an important log of that information for your child. And within that log, you also have the voice of the child in terms of what they want and how they feel and how they are experiencing the part-time timetable, as well as the school voice and the parent voice. So I think one would be very naive not to say that to enable this all to happen, it's really important that how the school, the school's culture and values towards children is pivotal in all of this. And this is where you know you're in a good school, because actually the school prioritizes that your child, who's whatever reasons that you have for them not being able to access school, even if they're clinically unwell, whether it's physically or medically, the school works hard with the family to enable that child to still feel a sense of belonging within the school, and that they still feel seen. Like someone like the form tutor or members of their tutor group, they have the occasional chats and connections with home, just to keep that child alive within that classroom. They work hard at finding access for learning, particularly around their literacy and numeracy. And they remembered, they're connecting with that child. That child hasn't disappeared. That child's voice is still in those classrooms. And it's about educating the wider community, all the other children, particularly when some children are going through particular difficulties. How do we educate the community so that when that child comes back into that frame, that they connect and they protect that child, and that child doesn't feel isolated. So, as we've already said, it's not about time. And by the time you get to a part-time timetable, the school will have already done so many adaptations and would have considered lots of different options that would have involved a range of different services. And so moving forward for that part-time timetable, the focus will be very much around the plan that needs to be in place, because we're aiming to get towards back into school. But what is that going to require? How are you going to maintain listening to the voice of the child? If you're a school, how do you continue to work with the parent? How do you continue to work with the child so that you are listening to those voices and making tweaks, literally tweaks, so that all the next steps are manageable by the family, manageable by the school, but actually enables a child to feel that they belong and that they are making progress. So that requires quite a bit of thinking, and and I say environment as well, because in some cases, I've been aware of children going into part-time timetables, but then accessing learning either at a hub or at a library, etc. My advice always to parents is that when your child is struggling in school, whatever those struggles are, it's really important that we remind ourselves that it's very difficult sometimes to understand for a child, for them to understand why they behave in certain ways or why they react in certain ways. They don't always know how to communicate their anxieties and their difficulties to adults at school, but also even parents. So your child, how they're feeling, and so talking to them and really understanding where those triggers are coming from, where those niggles, that anxiety is coming from. Understanding that is really important. And parents know their child best, so you're in the best position to really step into your child's shoes and seek that curiosity to understand their voice and their feelings. Most instances, I would say that children are just still too young to really have that self-awareness of understanding why they just get angry, they get frustrated, but they don't know how and why. It just happens. So my advice to parents is always to be your child's record keeper. And so when children are going through, it doesn't matter what situation your child's in, I think if your child is going through a tough patch, understanding good days and bad days, and keeping a record of those triggers or bits of information that you're picking up from them is really important, because that will then help the parent to have those conversations with school. And that's really, really important. You want to be able to go back to school and say, this is what's happening. This is what's occurred. And it could be certain days of the week. It could be because of bullying incidents in particular subject areas that they might have with certain children. It could be because actually a teacher just shouts too much, and that's that happens as well. If you've got auditory processing challenges and or sensory overload, shouting is a massive thing. So keeping a log of your child communicating to you what's happening is really important, and then it's using that information with school so that you can plan for your child. And school, really, services need to listen to that information. That's vital information if you really want to make progress with that child. So when it comes to parents and professionals, the guidance really states that when a child is out, they need to be out for the shortest time necessary, and it's a time-limited intervention. And it is important that this is interpreted in a way that benefits the child. Okay, so we can't rush a child back into school when they are socially, emotionally, the mental health is rock bottom, because they're only going to fail again. And what we want to do is reduce that failure. So there are no quick fixes, particularly around mental health. So our approach needs to be adapted to the child's needs. And success is very much dependent on a team effort, the partnership with the family, with the school, with other professionals, listening with compassion. And it's important to recognize that progress is not linear. It's not just going to happen. And there's going to be ups and downs along the way. But it needs to be focused on the child's circle of support. So their family, their friends, within school, their teachers, within the community. So really exploring how to bring all those together so that you're working towards a positive next step for that child with their learning. I think it's also important that we remind ourselves that being away from school has potential repercussions that need to be planned for and considered when planning for reduced timetables. So if children are away from school for a considerable amount of time, their friendship groups change, and that can leave the young person feeling isolated. And I'm coming back to that, I think, quite frequently, because I want to reinforce how difficult that is for children when they lose those friendship groups. All their friends just change into other friendship groups. They just make different arrangements, and then they can't connect with those friends again. So planning for staying in touch is really important. You want to avoid the them and us culture and work towards a we culture. So it's not parents and school, it's us working together towards finding solutions. Remember, English and maths are gateway subjects which cannot be compromised in a part-time timetable, because it will impact significantly on returning, and potentially it will just widen the gap even so significantly that it causes a lot of damage. When a child feels they're back in the classroom and they just can't follow, they're feeling inept. They will feel inept if they've got too many gaps. So they're already going to be feeling inept because they've already missed a lot of curriculum relative to their friends. But in English and maths, it's really vital that we build that up there so that we can then plan for the other subjects when they return. So, as I said, risk assessments are paramount, and I would always recommend that there should be regular reviews, a minimum of every 2 weeks. you don't want to go longer without a review of that part-time timetable, because you want to be tweaking things. And in some cases, you'd be maybe even reviewing on a weekly basis. In some serious cases, on a daily basis initially, until you build up to a week and then a fortnight. So there's no sort of quick fix. It's not a flow chart. It's very much about the child and the progress that they're making and the engagement with that progress to manage the next steps. And again, I think it's really important that we remind ourselves that the code of practice clearly states there's a duty on settings to implement a graduated approach to support the strengths and the needs of the learner. That's really important. And to always, from a professional perspective, remember that the wishes of the parent, the voice of the child, are paramount in all of us. So when designing a timetable, the most important thing is to design it with integrity. It's planned in the best interest of the child and is collaborated with the parents. It's not done to anyone. It's collaborated. It's a joined up approach. It's got to be realistic, because what we want is the child, the young person, to feel that they can. They need to feel that they can access. Understanding the barriers to really plan for those things that overwhelm them. And what you want to do is you want to create wins. So really being curious about understanding what are the barriers of that individual child, so that you can plan for that. And be individualized according to the specific needs of the child. And that again is about knowing the child, understanding the child. And remembering that we need to really collaborate right across the teachers, the staff, the parents, and the child. All that child, if that child is in secondary school, all their teachers need to be really aware and conscious of what's happening, and they need to be kept in the loop, so that when that child has any engagement in school, and he comes across, for example, a geography teacher who hasn't seen the child for 2 weeks, and the teacher doesn't potentially tell them off for missing a test or whatever. So it's really keeping the teachers in the loop, because we're all responsible for this child. We all have a part to play in showing care, in showing sensitivity towards wanting them back, but actually being conscious of the difficulties that they've got. And when starting that reduced timetable, it's really important to identify the difficulties, because a big part of that reduced timetable is you're going to need to consider the difficulties that has led you to this position where this child is on a reduced timetable. What can you do with the child and with the family so that you can work them through those difficulties? Because you're going to have to sort that out before the child returns back into school. So if it's a physical sort of access, then that's quite straightforward, because you might need to make sure that all the lifts in the school are working well-oiled, and there's access, and nothing's going to impede that child from getting around the building. But when it comes to social and emotional difficulties and learning, everything to do with cognition, you're going to need to really think carefully about how you're going to get that child in, and how you're going to problem solve with the child and with the family to overcome those difficulties. And remember, update, that timetable, that reduced timetable, really needs to be reviewed fortnightly. That's really important. I wanted to say something specific around vulnerable learners. This would be another whole webinar. But I'm just going to keep it short, in the sense that I think any child who's a child who's looked after, or a child who's on the child protection register, or child in a need plan, any of those groups of children, I would never start the process of a part-time timetable until I have had at least the opportunity to have a multi-agency sort of approach to planning something like that, because there are so many potential things that could go wrong with our most vulnerable groups. And I would say that it's the kind of arrangements that are put in place for children who are of this level of vulnerability needs to be very, very carefully considered and thought through, because there are safeguarding implications massively, and not just that, but also their mental health. So, so I think I just want to leave it at that, because as I said, that would be just a whole webinar as well, and I would never entertain the concept of going to a part-time timetable for children who've got these kind of risk factors around them, because actually school needs to be their safe place. School needs to be a form of therapy for them. So that's another kind of way of thinking and planning for these children. So thank you for joining me. I really hope you found this really helpful. If you need any further information, please don't hesitate to contact me at elsa@familypathway.co.uk. Thank you. Bye-bye.